Hello, I'm Drew Sieg, and I'm a visiting assistant professor at Middle Tennessee State University. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some experiential learning opportunities that I've been developing for ecology students at MTSU. So Middle Tennessee State University is really great in that we have an experiential learning community on campus. And so we have something called the EXL program, and it's all about developing new ways for students to experience cooperative education, leadership development, and service-based learning. And so students at MTSU actually can take a set number of EXL designated classes and graduate with a little marker saying that these are experiential learners as well as they leave. And so we have this support network for developing ways in which students can get more engaged with their community. And so I heard about this and I decided that it would be a perfect fit for the way that I like to teach ecology for our honors students. And so we put a proposal together and got it accepted. And so these are the results of that project. I also wanted to sort of give a quick plug to our Eureka program. So we have a undergraduate research experience funding agency through MTSU that allows students to do some great summer work and also semester-based work and present their research a couple times a semester on campus and give them that first personal or professional development research experience. And then one other quick plug is that we also work in conjunction with these groups through the Expanding Your Horizons network. So students also have an opportunity to promote the research that they're doing at Middle Tennessee State to a cohort of middle school girls in order to try and get them more interested in STEM fields. So all these programs at Middle Tennessee are all sort of promoting this idea of service-based learning, giving back to the community, getting involved with the community, and it was something that just worked great for an ecology class. And so my idea was to partner with our local Greenway. So Middle Tennessee State is in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It's in the geographic center of Tennessee. And we have about a 12-mile long Greenway system that I was surprised to learn many of our students didn't even know existed. And so it follows along Stones River. It kind of cuts through the entire town. They're expanding it tremendously. But it's prime access to a whole bunch of different types of systems. You've got stream ecology, you've got forest ecology, all right in their backyard. And so when I contacted the Greenway and said, would you like to do an EXL project with me, they were over the moon. The Greenway system has a lot of elementary school partnerships, but not very much in the way of college level partnerships. And so the idea of having local students get involved with their local community was a great opportunity for the Greenway, and they were all on board for it. So access to sites was easily obtained through this group. And so what I decided to do, this was my honors class. So at MTSU, we cap upper division classes at 15 students. And so this was the second time that honors ecology was offered. And a lot of our students at Middle Tennessee are more molecular or pre-med focused. So recruiting ecology students is always a little bit tricky. But here's our cohort of 7. You can spot the actual ecologist in the back there looking grungier than all of his students. But we recruited this cohort in, and I told them that they were going to be doing one major project through the entire semester, but they were going to get to design, implement, and actually do it. So I wasn't going to tell them what they were going to do. They were going to design the thing from scratch. And a couple of them were a little worried about this at first, but it turned out to work out really, really well. And so my sort of idea going forward with this is I wanted these students to realize what field ecological research is really like. And there are 3 steps to that process. So the first thing I wanted my students to do was, given a system, which was our Greenway, I wanted to have them think about what kinds of questions are pertinent, what can I ask, and then how do I figure out how to actually test the questions that I have. And so there was extensive work with regards to how to find scientific articles, how to read scientific articles, and then how to synthesize those articles into a comprehensive literature review. Additionally, they started coming up with different possible experiments that they could do, and they'd come to me and say, how do I do this exactly? And I'd give them a couple of ideas, a couple of hints, but by and large I'd say, you need to figure out how you want to test this out yourself. I will be able to get you equipment, but you're going to need to figure out what you're actually going to do. And I'd obviously proofread it afterwards, but the onus was on them to try and figure out how to actually approach their question. And so after surveying the Greenway and after coming up with some potential ideas, their first major assignment that they had to compose was working as an entire group So all 7 students worked on one project. They had to write up an extensive research proposal. So just like if they're going into graduate school and they're going to have to apply for grant funding and exposure to things like that, I wanted it to let them see what that process is like. So it's not writing a lab report, it's thinking about funding, it's thinking about environmental impact, it's thinking about cultural impact and community impact. And some of this was kind of challenging for them, but I told them this is a lot more like what it's going to be like going forward if you pursue a career in graduate school. And so once I had approved their research proposal, had them make edits as necessary, they were able to go out and do the experiments. So we had our partnership with the Greenway. Students went out to the Greenway and they started collecting their data, bringing samples back to the lab, and collecting that massive data set. And there were 3 major components to sort of see how they the final assessments for this project. So the first was the traditional lab report, but since there were 7 of them, I had them all collaboratively work on that one lab report, similar to how you have several authors on a single research publication. And we had experts in different areas of the project that could contribute more to different sections of that lab report. They had to also give a research talk, similar to the kinds of talks that you give at academic presentations or conferences. And the part that kind of surprised them was that when they gave that research talk, they weren't just giving it to me, but they were also giving it to other faculty members and community members. So I invited representatives of our Murfreesboro Parks and Recreation Department. They came and sat in on this as well. And then the final part was, in terms of that community engagement aspect, students had to develop some sort of educational display. And again, I left it up to them as to what they wanted to make. So they could have geared it towards elementary school students or high school students or concerned citizens, but I left it up to them as to how they did what they wanted to do. And so the rest of this little talk, I'll show you some of those pieces as we go along. So again, here's the Murfreesboro Greenway, and so you can see in red on the left, you can see the trail of the Murfreesboro Greenway System. And if you look very carefully on the right-hand side of that map, you can see Middle Tennessee State University. So this is literally right in their backyard. It's a 5-10 minute drive. There is the West Fork of Stones River running through the town. There are little tributaries running off of that as well. So there's this aquatic ecosystem available. And so the first thing I did is, I think in about the 2nd or 3rd week of class, we took a bus out and we all walked part of the Greenway. And I said I told my students to be looking for potential things that would catch their eye in terms of an interesting research project. So they could focus on the terrestrial system, they could focus on the aquatic system, they could look at land use changes, they could look at riparian buffers, they could look at whatever they wanted, but just be brainstorming. And a lot of them had never even been to the Greenway before, and so this was a novel trip for a lot of them. And the thing that actually caught their eye is in the parking lot next to where we parked our bus, they noticed that there were puppy dogs everywhere. And so a lot of the students got really excited and they started, oohing and aahing over the puppy dogs. And they went over and looked at the park that was there and noticed this big sign that had sort of the rules of the road in terms of what you can do with your dogs. And the one that jumped out at them is this idea of always dispose your dog's waste in trash receptacles. Now this bark park was maybe 200 meters away from the water of Stones River. And as we were doing the rest of our survey, students noticed that not everybody was playing along with the rules of the bark park, and there was fecal material sort of spread throughout not all over the Greenway, but sporadically you'd see people that hadn't cleaned up after their pets. And so my students sort of honed in on this idea and thought about the fact, well, you've got this big aggregation of dogs in this one central location, and it's on a hill sloping downwards towards the water supply. So they wondered whether or not the impact of this bark park could be detected downstream versus upstream of Stones River. And so this was the project idea that they came up with. Again, I said you have to do something at the Greenway. Then I left it at that. This is what they settled on. So their question became, is pollution from the bark park affecting the water quality in the West Fork of Stones River? And so when they take this question, it's great because they can approach it from multiple different ecological angles. So they can look in terms of ecosystem level effects, thinking about whether or not different nutrient levels are affecting flora, fauna, the rest of the ecosystem within that aquatic system. They can look at community level changes with the plants or with the animals living within the area, and they could even just focus on specific population level effects. But all of these can be attributed and studied at different spatial scales using this system at the Greenway. And so we did a brainstorming session. They wrote up a bunch of ideas ranging from whether or not you see a shift in the density of trees on the riparian zone. Benthic macroinvertebrates came up a bunch as bioindicators of potential pollution. There were several students that are interested in pursuing a career in microbiology, so there was questions about bacterial diversity, impact of fecal coliform bacteria, things like that. So all kinds of different ideas came up on the board. In the end, they focused on two of those. The first was whether or not fecal input from the bark park could increase the frequency or the density of fecal indicating bacteria, so fecal coliforms. And so this was one of the projects that they decided to focus on. So they said, well, how do we do this? And I said, that's what the literature review is for. And so they looked at different ways in which you can culture fecal indicating bacteria, and they actually settled on these neat little plates. There's these little paper pre-made plates used a lot in the food service industry to look for E. coli and coliforms, and it's a very visual colorimetric assay where different colors and the formation of air bubbles and pockets can determine the density. You can use that to determine the density of coliforms within the water supply. So they honed in on this. I'd never used this technique before, but it ended up working really, really well. So we had sort of a small microbiology level microbial ecology project, but some students wanted to work with things they could actually see. So the other major part of this project was determining whether or not we could determine the water quality of Stones River using benthic macroinvertebrates. So benthic macroinvertebrates is a big fancy word for the bugs in the water. So we're looking at the different species of insects and other invertebrates that are found within the water supply. And there are established metrics to say, well, if you have a lot of mayflies or stoneflies, that suggests that you have cleaner water systems. And if you have a lot of leeches and worms and snails, that suggests that the water is a little bit more polluted. And by looking at the relative diversity of the different insects or invertebrates within the system, they can use that information to say, well, we have a moderately polluted or a very clean water supply. And so they took these two ideas and they decided they were going to look upstream of the dog park and downstream of the dog park to see whether or not they could actually see any differences due to runoff from the stream or from the dog park. And so they had these ideas, and then I said, okay, you've got your ideas. How are you going to do it? So they did an extensive literature review. They figured out the methodology from there. And then they had to come together to put together a research proposal, and they had to sell me as their funding agency on the project. So they had to justify everything they wanted to do. And I said they had to tell me what they were going to do. I gave them a budget of $300. They had to explicitly state what the intellectual merit of this project was, as well as the community impact. So how is this going to, why would a citizen in Murfreesboro care about you doing this in the first place? And so what the class decided to do is they broke into subcommittees of experts. So everybody got to do everything, but we had like two students that really knew the benthic macroinvertebrate literature, and we had two students that really knew the fecal coliform literature. And we had one sort of team leader that was sort of supervising everything. So we had these sort of expert groups, even though everybody got to do everything. And that made it really more accessible for students to put this whole project together. And so here are a couple of images of my students in action. So here they are setting out leaf litter bags in Stones River. The student in the water was very excited to jump in the water at every opportunity. And so to collect macroinvertebrates, the students put out leaf litter bags for several weeks, and they brought them back to the lab and sorted the bugs. We did some lab work too, so those that didn't want to jump in the water immediately did more of the lab-based work. So this is one student who's evaluating the density of fecal coliform bacteria on those plates that I talked about earlier. Here's another student taking some of that leaf litter and rocks and sorting through it, looking for insects and macroinvertebrates, sorting and identifying. This worked out really well too, because they were doing this part of the project at the same time we were doing community ecology and lecture. And so when we're talking about Simpson's diversity index and things like that, they're actually able to use those same metrics with the samples that they've collected. These are just representative images of some of the stuff they found. Sort of as a spoiler alert, they found that the Stones River was relatively polluted. They had lots of leeches, which you see on the right, lots of scuds or amphipods, which are on the left, a couple of other, lots of snails as well. So things that tended to suggest more polluted waters. And so they worked on this project for a series of, I think they went to the Greenway 4 or 5 different times. They also tried to measure nutrient levels. As you can see, that data set didn't work out particularly well. Everything was sort of constant throughout. They admitted afterwards that that part of the proposal they thought they had to work on just a little bit more. They noticed trends in invertebrate diversity. I don't really care too much about the data that we're actually showing, but what we're seeing here is that they were able to think about how to collect, analyze, and then interpret the data that they were collecting. By and large, they found that upstream and downstream, there wasn't that much of a difference for most of the metrics they looked at. Similar deals with bacterial loads, but they're collecting data, they're thinking of ways to analyze it, and then we're able to do statistics, t-tests and ANOVAs and things like that, using the data that they've actually collected. And so there's this greater personal investment, and some of them actually decided to do relatively complex statistics that was beyond the scope of the class, but they wanted to do it the right way, so I pointed them in the right direction for that. And what was really inspiring about this whole project was the fact that initially when we set it up, like I had booked a van for every trip we were going to take to the Greenway, and we did that once or twice, and then the students came to me after about the second time and said, we want to make sure that we can do all of this. Is it okay if we go 2-3 hours early, collect all of the stuff in the field, bring it back so we have the whole time left after class or during lab to actually do stuff in the classroom? And so this was all out of their own initiative. They were volunteering extra time out of their day just to go ahead and try and get as much of this data as possible, which was really interesting and really cool. And of course, I let them do it. So they collected a lot of ecological data. It was nothing groundbreaking, but it was all stuff that they were able to develop themselves. But the aspect that threw them off a little bit was, unlike a lot of their other classes they've taken so far, they also had to think about, well, why am I doing this, and what's the environmental and community impact of this? So on the other side of this graph here, we've got environmental impact, community impact, and potential economic impact. So what do their results actually do for the community? And so to communicate with our community, we held a forum, and the students were able to talk about all the research that they'd collected. We invited faculty, we invited Murfreesboro Parks and Recreation representatives, all of which came in, had a lot of questions, and by and large, the students had found that they saw evidence of pollution and evidence of fecal coliforms, but they didn't really see too much in the way of upstream versus downstream of the dog park. So they talked a lot about how they could resolve those issues, thinking about the way that they did their sampling methods. But then they also got some really interesting insights from our Parks and Recreation representatives in terms of like facts that the local dump trucks were rinsing off their trucks in this area, and that could also be sources of runoff. There was large car washes and other things near downtown that was flowing close to where their sampling sites were. So the bark park effect might not have been quite as strong as some of these other sources as well. But the students were sort of curious about this, and actually one of them, the student on the right with a tie, on his own time decided he's going to go out and do a greater survey of all of these things over the summer just because he's still curious about it. So they gave this talk to the community, and then they also decided that the way that they were going to develop an educational tool was to create a pamphlet that can be posted at the bark park. And so this is the cover of the pamphlet there. And so the idea was to sort of pitch this to sort of a elementary to middle school audience, and just tell them a little bit about how you can look at the effects of pollutants into the water. So again, this is the back. I'm just sort of showing you these, so if you want to pause it and read it, you can. But you can see sort of major takeaway points, what the project was about, how they did it, and just as a way to sort of show current research that's being done in the local community and maybe inspire a couple of younger kids to actually want to go ahead and do scientific research. These pamphlets are now in the possession of our Parks and Recreation Department. They're hoping to be able to put some of them up at the bark park, and then they've even been asking whether or not they can adapt some of it for signage as well. So they're giving a product back to the community as well. And so when you conclude on this, so we had this community engagement, students developing their own research project, learning the process of science, and I did do some informal surveys at the end, and so I've just highlighted three particular three particular quotes from them, from these surveys. And so the first was, it's learning how to collaborate diverse methods for one common goal was very insightful and applicable. So rather than having sort of standardized, we're doing this lab this week, we're doing that lab next week, they had a sort of communal direction to their project itself. So they're getting to see multiple lines of evidence to support one basic question. Secondly, the students had said, I'd never been a part of any large research project like this. I learned a lot about how to work in a group, how to be cooperative, and tons about microbes, nutrients, and macroinvertebrates. So they saw the collaborative nature of science. Science isn't done in a bubble or in a vacuum. It's done with a community of other like-minded scientists, and collaborations are key. And they got that exposure through this project. And then finally, I gained fieldwork experience that I'd never done before, and it made me realize that there are more research opportunities available than just sitting at a desk with a microscope. So this came from a pre-med student. He's hoping to do an MD PhD program. He's very lab oriented. And yet by the end of this, he'd really come to appreciate the complexity and the importance of doing ecological research as well. So several students had come in thinking ecology was just going to be a bunch of long-haired hippies that didn't really want to do anything but look at trees. And they realized how microbiology fits in, how genetics fits in, how evolution fits in, and how it all connects together. And it really caught their interest. And so this worked as a great model for me. Hopefully it can be an inspiring partial project for you. And my main suggestion is just look around your local community. A lot of them are really excited to get involved with undergraduates. And then my other comment would be, don't be afraid of the fact that you might not know exactly where that project is going at the beginning of the semester. It could be kind of daunting to say you get to do whatever you want, but with a little bit of flexibility, it actually works out pretty well. And so as long as you're willing to sort of, help students through and make sure that these projects are gonna, be task oriented, it actually works out really great for you and develops new research that can be used potentially for publication as well, either in pedagogical or research avenues. So feel free to contact me if you have any other questions, but I hope this was helpful for you. Thanks.